All right. Welcome. I want to welcome a good friend of mine, Derek Newman Stille, to Paranormal Matters. Uh, Welcome, Derek.
Hi, how are you, Rick?
I'm doing great. So, Derek has been a friend of mine for, oh, geez, 24 years, 23 years,
Oh
something
God,
like
you said
that.
it out loud.
Well, yes, I could have said in another century, but that would be a lie.
Oh, that's great.
So I've gotten to know Derek in the decades that we've been friends, and in some ways, Derek has been an inspiration to me when it comes to the niche area of research, academia, and creative writing that I'm involved with.
Yeah.
And just to share some of the accolades of Derek, Derek has edited and published so many short stories. So, Nothing Without Us is one of the volumes that you're in, as well as We Shall Be Monsters, which is a
Yes.
volume that you edited and
Abs
published with Renaissance Press. So, if
yes,
folks are interested, they can find that.
absolutely. They can also find my collection of stories with Nathan Frechette called Whispers Between Fairies. It's also available through Renaissance Press. And in it, Nathan and I reimagine fairy tales with modern identities and with an awareness of the multiplicities of identities in place. And so we actually we queer those fairy tales, we disable them, we add BIPOC characters to them, and remake them in a way that is not so Eurocentric, straight, homophobic, transphobic, etc. Because we recognize that those fairy tales are marginalia and they deserve to feature marginalized people.
And you know what? You just reminded me. So I have a very plain and boring background, but I didn't want to do that for this interview. So if you could just forgive me for a moment, I'm going to get out a canvas and I'm going to get out my paintbrushes and maybe I'm going to splash some color for
Yeah.
this interview.
Yes. And happy Pride.
Right? It's Pride Month, so that's I think entirely appropriate,
Absolutely.
especially now, but at all times to have a banner like this. Although I will say this isn't like the token Pride interview for Paranormal Matters, because
Yeah.
we have been planning to get together. Uh, because you graciously invited me to be a guest on your podcast. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Speculating Canada originally actually came out of a sort of desire to um, reimagine Canadian fiction, look at aspects of it was originally a review site, and so I started out by doing book reviews of Canadian speculative fiction, and then sort of moved into, as I was developing closer relationships with the authors, moved into a podcast situation and have been able to interview authors, get their perspectives, and get them to share aspects of what inspires their work. And I like to go kind of beyond the typical author questions. You know, people are like, when did you start writing? How long have you been writing? How did you get into the market? I find that stuff has already been done, so I like to probe deeper. And so Speculating Canada is about kind of pushing the boundary just a little bit to look beyond the surface level. And I have to say, I've been really lucky. I won 9 Aurora Awards for it, which are Canada's top awards in science fiction and fantasy. And so that has been really, really amazing. And I'm really lucky that I have the folks who follow it who do. If you want to check it out, it's at speculatingcanada.ca. And you can see my interview with Rick, along with my interviews of various Canadian authors, academics, researchers, and folks who have interesting perspectives on the speculative.
Wow, that is it's quite an accomplishment. In comparison, I have zero Aurora awards, which is okay.
One day,
but
Rick, one day.
but this is what happens when you are when your work is something that you absolutely love, right?
Exactly. There's a
Yeah.
passion.
And so Derek is a disability scholar with a love of speculative fiction, and I think that there are considerable intersections with my area of interest, and that is the paranormal. And in an attempt to emulate you, I also like to go beyond. Oh, this UFO was seen on this date. Was it true or not? Like completely do
Exactly.
away with that and let's find space and increase the volume on the intersections of things like disability studies and the paranormal because
Yeah.
when you and I actually visited this conversation a few months ago, I very quickly realized that there is a discussion that has to be had. And in particular, you and I were talking about psychic grifters. Most recently, we were having this discussion,
Absolutely.
and I was really dismayed. And when and I was naive going into our conversation. I had a sense that this occurs, but you actually gave it quite some dimension. Is that something that you can speak about now?
Absolutely. I think a lot of the roots of this in terms of disability start with the idea that people assume that disabled folks are broken and in need of fixing. The idea, Eli Clare talks about this around the notion of the cure, how disabled people are shaped in our cultural imagination by ideas of the cure, not the band, but the cure, and that we are going to, in some way, we should appreciate folks' attempts at fixing us. It's interesting that we do have a lot of folks, um, for many of us in the disabled community, we've talked about this, but folks will come up and lay on hands without permission or start doing like Blu-ray healing around our bodies without our permission, or tell us like, I've said a prayer for you to be fixed. And all of this is problematic in terms of this idea of pushing either religious ideas or ideas of psychic phenomena upon our bodies, making the assumption that we're broken in some way and that we need to be fixed or cured. So I've had folks come up and put stones on me without my permission, touch my back, which is where my spine I have a spinal injury, and without my permission. And of course, that actually hurts as well. Um, and so it's really interesting to see that. And unfortunately, this results in a lot of folks exploiting the disabled community as well, because there is so much internalized ableism. So many people in the disabled community believe the messages that we get that we're broken, that we're incomplete, that we're not worthy, and that we need to be fixed. And because of this, so many folks go out and look for alternative medicine options to fix their bodies. A lot of folks go to religious sources where there are faith healers and assumptions that the faith healer will fix them. Dominic Parisien has written about this significantly in terms of his own experiences as a child, where he was brought to faith healers and religious personalities who were supposed to fix him of his brain tumor. And so it's really interesting to see that so many folks exploit disabled bodies in this way and profit off of our bodies as well. Because so many of us get stuck in this mentality that we need to be cured in order to fit into our society, rather than that our society needs to change to accommodate all of our bodies. Sorry, I've been blabbing on a lot.
No need to apologize because that is giving me so much insight into, I guess, an area of society, let's say paranormal community, occult, uh, that is itself marginalized
Yeah.
in many respects because it doesn't fit the normative values of the 24/7 or the dominant religious uh, types that are sort of the cultural substrata of Western society. but to see those exact same normative values repeated as if by doing them they will somehow perhaps be accepted within society. Or why do you think that might be?
It's interesting because, like, as you mentioned, mainstream religions have been profiting off of faith healing for disabled or chronically ill individuals for centuries, and have made significant money from that, as well as increasing their reputation, increasing the personal reputation of faith healers as well. But there are faith healers outside of those mainstreams, and as you pointed out, it's interesting that they also buy into that cultural messaging around disabled people need to be fixed. Rather than there are so many alternative ways of viewing disabled bodies within the paranormal community, like perhaps we needed to have this difference of body in order to understand things in a different way. Perhaps that our bodies are not, the key thing is our bodies are not broken. We are complete whole individuals. Would I look for a cure for my pain? Yes. Would I accept a cure for my ADHD or my learning disabilities? No. I think it's interesting that so many different things, we have different feelings about them, right? About our different disabilities. And my disabilities have made me who I am. I wouldn't have erased that part of my history, in order to figure out who I am. However, again, I would like my pain to go away. And I would like a more accessible society. And I
Hmm.
think that's one of the key things is that like folks in the psychic community should be focusing on changing the message around disabled bodies rather than changing our bodies.
Right? And so I might be naive when I think of the historic and the traditional role of what we call the witch or the wise person who is or what would have been, and I'm thinking Scotland in particular, just because I've been reading untold numbers of books about it,
Yes,
where they would have been in direct communion and communication with the Fae or the fairy realm. And it wouldn't necessarily be to draw on prescriptive formulas to make people normative. But it, and they themselves would not be normative folks, but they would
exactly.
be drawing wisdom from that other world or that whatever place or whatever beings occupy that particular area. But again, I could be naive when I'm thinking this.
Well, it's really interesting. So, in terms of a like British, Scottish, Irish kind of perspective, Welsh perspective, often the one of the concerns about disabled bodies. So frequently, when disabled people would be born, if they had congenital disabilities that were visible, if they didn't cry, if they had deformities, quote unquote, then they would often be assumed to be changelings. And so there's this history. Sorry, for folks that don't know, a changeling is basically when a fairy substitutes the body of your own child with one of their children, and takes the human child away. And there are interesting like groups of spells around these ideas of banishing the fairy child. And so they would do things like put the baby on a shovel that had been heated in a fire and to tell. And if it transforms, then it's a fairy. If it doesn't, then you got a dead baby on your hands. Um, and so a lot of these assumptions were made about disabled people that we were problems, that we were otherworldly, and that we didn't belong in the community. But I wonder about also that connection that you talked about in terms of when we're recognized as having a body that kind of rubs up against normalcy, that challenges normalcy. I wonder if a lot of the wise folk, a lot of the folks that were believed to be witches or that did herbal work or that did wild witch kind of work, were also disabled folks, because frequently it is the others in our society that seek out a lot of these options and seek out the alternatives. So it's really fascinating to see the way disability portrays or it can be seen within these different contexts, right?
Oh, I wasn't prepared for this, and
Oh,
just
sorry.
no, don't apologize, because I think this is the depth of perspective that you offer. Uh, I'm the one who should say sorry, because like I'm naive when it comes to some of these topics, and I appreciate you shedding or sharing this dimension with me. And I say so because folks like myself, who I consider myself to be a normative uh, uh, fella, but I just see the dominance and the preponderance of normative folks casting the narrative when it comes to things like fairies, when it comes to the history. And do we get into this trap where we romanticize?
Absolutely. I'm glad you pointed that out too, that romanticization of disabled bodies. Within disability studies, we refer to this as inspiration porn. And so inspiration porn is when basically folks are like, look at this disabled person. They're able to accomplish something. Therefore, you as an able-bodied person should be able to accomplish so much more. And of course, this does problematic stuff around this idea of, first of all, presenting that person's any accomplishment that person makes as amazing and different. But it also makes the sense of the basically using us to shame able-bodied people, using us and basically telling us that what we need to do is overcome our disability, that we need to be both disabled and never let it show. And so, of course, in Canada here, we have the key example of Terry Fox, who serves as that inspiration porn image, someone who continued running even though it was harming him more, even though it was literally killing him. And this is the message that we get as disabled people, that we should be Terry Fox like, that we should go to regular jobs, work normal hours, push ourselves beyond our disability. And that's just not viable for most disabled folks. And also, I don't want to be a runner. I have no interest in that whatsoever. So it's really interesting to see that lens being applied to us, including when folks will see that I have learning disabilities, ADHD, and I'm working on a PhD. People are often very surprised by that, because they're like, it's amazing that you've overcome all of these obstacles. And I'm like, no, they're still there. So
Yes, and this message is actually, it's ubiquitous. Like, you can't turn on any television channel without seeing a commercial that does exactly what you are saying.
exactly. We notice it in terms of, in disability studies, we refer to this as the medical model or charity model because they're interwoven. And charities have profited from this idea of saying the problem is here in the body of the person. The issue is with the disabled person, so we need to fix the disabled person. Whereas the social model of disability says actually the problem is out there. It's the fact that we have a society that is built only for certain types of bodies and presents all other bodily options as problem bodies. So it's really fascinating, right? And
Oh, it is, and it's unfortunately infiltrated every aspect of our society. Even, as I said, the marginal ones
yeah,
that themselves don't receive acceptance within at least our society.
you would think that there would be some intertwining, right? Between those of us that are underrepresented or those of us that are negatively represented, that we would at least have some sort of alliance together in terms of like, let's stick it to the normies.
Well, maybe this is something that you and I, in some of our discussions that are occurring off camera, right, and not the podcast. We like this; these are things that you and I can talk about with future collaborations and so on. But so um, I want to mention something to you that going back to my earlier comment about how in many ways you inspire me to think differently or to reevaluate my own naivete when it comes to different things. When I was a guest on your show
Yeah.
a few months ago, you had said something that I was nodding and agreeing with and kind of smiling like, oh yeah, right on. And it was a term you used that I had never actually heard before, but
Oh,
I just kind of I
I
played it
love
off
that.
like
Oh yeah, I know that.
I know exactly what you're talking about. And meanwhile, it was like that is such a cool word, and I wanted to know more about it. So now that you're on my show and all my faults
That's great.
you just got to rip these band-aids off, right?
Yes.
So you had used the word hauntology, and it
Oh
blew my
yeah.
mind. Tell me about it, please.
So hauntology is something that Jacques Derrida uses in terms of this idea that objects have history. And so I applied that to this idea that spaces have history in terms of this ghost phenomenon. And so I was like, let's take hauntology literally and point out that buildings, for example, have a history that lasts beyond us. We only occupy them for a certain time. They have existence before us. And so there's something in our imagination that wants to complete this idea. And so we think to ourselves of this object with history behind it and wonder on some subconscious level, who was here before? Could they still be here? Is their presence on this house imprinted in the fabric of this house? Is it projected into the walls? Is it projected into the floor? And so I think about when I hear ghost stories, that's often what I first think about is the way that our minds naturally move toward that possibility of a hauntology, but a literal hauntology of feeling like we're being haunted by people who have occupied that space in the past. Particularly when we find out, again, it normally starts just with that pondering of who was here first, but also when we hear about a death in that space, all of a sudden we become convinced that that body has imprinted on that space, and that it's never fully ours, that it's always theirs. And it's partially because we just fixate on it.
Wow, I have chills from your response, and it actually has me thinking of not just houses, but hauntology can be in forests with ideas of cryptids and so on, where you don't see a cryptid inside a home necessarily, but you do in a forest.
Exactly. And it's interesting because we've always had this strange discomfort with forest spaces. This can track back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, literally the first piece of written literature, where one of the beings that Gilgamesh fights, whose name I am blanking on right now, is a spirit of the forest. And
Is it was Humwawa or something similar to that? That
yeah. And the spirit represents the forest. And of course, what it represents is this idea of him spreading his idea of civilization outward. And so once the forest encroaches on humanity, when those two spaces rub up against each other, that's a liminal space, right? A space that is betwixt and between, a space that we're uncomfortable with because we don't like those uncertain spaces. And so what do? We populate that space with monsters and we tell ourselves, this is the space of us. The civilization is our space. Out there is the other. That's where, like, here be dragons. It's unexplored. It's probably full of cryptids. And I find, like, as you know, Rick, I have this fascination with the figure of the monster. And particularly, like, this is tracked through my classical research in terms of ancient Greece and Rome, through my medieval research, especially looking at the medieval werewolf, because ridiculously cool, up to my modern study of cryptids and the way that we use these figures to imagine otherwise in our spaces, particularly in North America where again, we are haunted by the colonialism of our culture, by the fact that we are on stolen land, And especially, we literally have enacted and continue to enact a genocide of indigenous people. So, what do we do instead? We populate this space with monsters. We imagine that there are monsters within that space, within these spaces of otherness, within these spaces of uncertainty, within these spaces of colonialism, where we have done this damage and taken this space as our own from indigenous folks. So I think there's something really fascinating about the way that we construct monsters as our other and populate them in spaces that are quote unquote unexplored, right? And what we mean by unexplored is unconquered by white people, quote unquote.
While simultaneously, I would add to that, their perceived grotesquity or grotesqueness is a reflection of our own actions.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Absolutely. I
It's kind of like
love,
the funhouse mirror, right? Where what you're actually doing is you're looking at yourself. You're looking at an aspect of yourself that you have not come to terms with. That's why you're so frightened of it.
exactly. It is what we project in order to understand ourselves. So Jeffrey Jerome Cohen talks about this idea in his Monster Culture Seven Theses, when he talks about the idea that monsters are our children. We literally create them. We create them to embody our fears, our anxieties, our uncertainties, and they take on characteristics of those and our desires as well. Because I think that's really interesting that they take on all of these scary points, but they also take on desire. We have a desire to be free, a desire to escape civilization and enter into the woods, to become one with Sabe, one with the Bigfoot. And I think it's really fascinating to see that idea of the way that we construct these monsters as our foil, as what is not us, in order to better understand us. And particularly here in what is colonially called Canada, we construct the idea of Americans as our other, right? We basically, if someone asks what a Canadian is, we start describing what we're not, which we use American imagery for.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. I just want to stop you there because there might
yeah.
be Americans listening to this, and I
Oh
might
yeah.
have to edit. I might have to edit this out because they're not supposed to know that.
It's amazing when I tell my Canadian studies students about this, and they're like, and some of them are American, and they're like, really? And they're like, no, I've noticed. You're right. You really Canadians really do this, and
Yeah, and you know what? I think that also it takes on an inside joke that no American actually cares about because they don't think about us.
exactly because we don't matter. But it's fascinating, right? So we have to create these ideas of the foil, the other, in order to understand ourselves. And so the other takes on all of these characteristics. I say that monsters are sticky, not because they're covered in slime, but because they take on all of these characteristics that we don't want for ourselves. And so I think about Sabe in particular. Sorry, Sabe is the Anishinaabe Moan word for Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And this figure often takes on imagery of ferocity that we don't want to have, but also, weirdly enough, the gentle Bigfoot exists, right? So we project this idea of wouldn't it be great if we lived in communion with nature, if we had these like um, characteristics of an animal. But there's that duality, right? Of the animal being our other, something that is too close to us. It's too close to the uncanny valley, right? It's that much too close to us and that much too different from us. And then at the same time, we have that desire for that as well. Like, wouldn't it be great if we could go out and wouldn't we be, if we lived within nature, wouldn't we be gentle giants as well? So it's really fascinating.
Absolutely. I appreciate the the depths that you're taking this conversation because this is what I strive for when I have guests such as yourself. Now you had mentioned to me that you wanted to speak a bit about cryptids. Was this what you were wanting to say, or
Yes.
was there another dimension to it?
There's another dimension to it. So I should say I'm working on a zine right now about Ontario cryptids in particular. And I find it really interesting. So just obviously there are different kind of images of Sabe around Ontario, of Bigfoot around Ontario. So there's well-known figures are the Temagami Bigfoot, and Old Yellowtop, who is like a Bigfoot character, but with a kind of swath of blonde hair at the top. And so I find those creatures fascinating. But ironically, we have a lot of city creatures as well. So as much as we project the idea of the monster on the other, we also can't help but imagine what lurks beneath, the subcanny, the below the norm, the thing that creeps around. So we have a number of lake monsters, particularly around the Toronto area. And there's a few of them out there. There's Kingsey, who is the Kingston Nessie. And so that figure exists in the water around Kingston and haunts the shores. There's Igopogo, which is the sort of water monster equivalent of Ogopogo, who is a figure out in BC, and Manapogo, a figure out in Winnipeg. So we get our own here in Ontario, Igopogo. And Igopogo is often kind of believed to be in the Barrie area. And in Barrie, they also call her, oh, what was her name? Tebbenfelt Kelly. And so she's got this cutesy name as well. And then so I find it really fascinating, right? The way that we create these monsters in order to understand ourselves. Oh, and there's the Metrosaurus as well, which is another figure right around Ontario Place, and in the waters around Ontario Place. So we have these figures, right? And so those ones are on the edges, but we also have figures like the Toronto uh, tunnel monster as well. So the Toronto tunnel monster is a figure that people have claimed to have come across in the tunnels under Toronto, and have seen this like golem-like character, like, almost Lord of the Rings-esque, being like creeping along, being shorter than humans, kind of simian-like, ape-like characteristics. And it's reportedly goes, go away. And so it's really interesting. So it has speech, right? And so I find it fascinating to see that the monsters are not just city creatures or not just country creatures and edges and forested areas. They're also creatures that we occupy our cities with, recognizing that they're also spaces of otherness.
Can I add to your list?
Yeah,
Le Nain Rouge, the Red Devil. So in Windsor, in Chatham, Wallaceburg, and in Detroit. This goes back to French colonization period in the 1700s of Fort Pontchartrain or Detroit, in which when a building, a home, or a barn would be engulfed in flames, you would see a little man dancing and grimacing in the window of the
oh, I
house.
love that.
Yeah, so Le Nain Rouge is definitely up there, and it's one of those beings that has a deep history with
Yeah.
settler society. Uh, and again, pointing out the grotesque nature of, I guess, having domesticity turned upside down and inverted with the presence of a little gnomic figure, which also has its roots in France, but was very quickly transported here. So now you have like sports teams like, I think, the Red Devils, right? Which uh, is a direct reference to that history. But whether that history is known or not, it's just, hey, we're the Red Devils. But it's actually Le Nain Rouge.
That is so fascinating. Oh, and I see there's motorcycle clubs named after them and everything.
Oh, I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me because it's a marginal character, right? It's a marginal figure, and an ominous one. Like I guess the tunnel creature and the some of the other ones that you were mentioning.
Well, it's fascinating too to see, especially the facet. Sorry, I'm going to geek out a little bit about like Bigfoot characters, Sabe, because they're seen throughout North America in different ways. So there's the in Florida, they have the skunk ape, who is a Bigfoot who happens to stink like a skunk. Like you smell him before you see him. We have these figures kind of spread out, and in most of the states, most of Canada, there are these figures who people believe strongly in. And I think this traces back, first of all, to Indigenous heritage around Sabe for Anishinaabe people, but there may be different equivalents elsewhere. I'm mostly more familiar with Anishinaabe folks. But also to, in terms of European settlers, there was the wild man in medieval manuscripts, and he was often a hairy, wild figure who folks would come across. He'd be depicted in marginalia around the margins of medieval manuscripts. In churches, there would be images of the wild man alongside images of the green man. And I think there's something really fascinating about this idea of the hairy figure. And it is often a male figure. And I think this presents the kind of imagery of the excessively masculine, this idea of like hair gone wild.
You know, the biggest exception to that though is what was her name? Bessie, the Patterson Gimlin film, like the ubiquitous Bigfoot that was filmed in the late 1960s in California, which you know, folks have said that's not a man, that's a woman.
Exactly.
And so that's sort of like the ubiquitous term. Bigfoot comes from that particular moment in time. That so you know there are exceptions, but very rare. But in this particular case, you know the emblematic ubiquitous silhouette that you see is actually a woman.
Exactly. I love the way that that disrupts things, right? Like it challenges these notions. And especially like people have noted the way that she moves is very, very much like the imagery of someone who might be pregnant or have breast tissue. The way that she's kind of hunched over indicates like breasts. So I think that's really fascinating.
So again, like within or maybe not again, but that to me is a shining example within a marginalized community not going with the normative route, right?
Exactly.
So not all aspects of the marginalized paranormal community do they go for the normative route, especially when someone like Bessie is sort of the emblem.
Exactly. I love that. And especially like seeing these figures being so interesting for people. Like the fact that we fixate on this idea of a missing link, because the Bigfoot has kind of been applied in with Darwinian theories around these ideas of where would we get this hairy ape-like thing that walks upright and is as tall as a person? Well, hey, we have Darwin who talks about this idea of an ancestry from a common ancestor for humans and apes. And so maybe this is the common ancestor, which is fascinating because the ones that we've actually discovered are tiny. All of the pre-hominids are very small.
Absolutely. And you know what's interesting on that note that you're speaking about. There's some researchers in Appalachia area, Joshua Cutchins and Timothy Renner, who are actually saying we need to look at the symbolic significance of this, perhaps more than the materiality of it. So when you look at the materiality of it, you really get in this trap of saying true or false as this
Exactly.
binary without this much wider opening avenue in between that says, well, maybe
Why?
there's something about us that we need to be asking when we see this thing out there.
Exactly. We're confronted with the true or false when the question is actually why. Why do we want this creature to exist? Why do we believe in this? Why do we see this figure? Whether it's real or not doesn't matter. The main thing is there's something that is interesting to humanity about this other. And I think it's fascinating to see that human interest and to look deeper at why we create these images or why these images fascinate us so
Hmm.
much.
So those two, Cutchins and Renner, wrote two books. It's a two-volume series called Where the Footprints End, and they actually ask they they treat the witness reports and don't ridicule them,
Yes,
which I
exactly.
think is something I think that ufologists like Jacques Vallée and Diana Pasulka do, right? Where it's like, well, no, like if this is a phenomenon that people are coming out and saying that they've experienced, let's actually listen to their story without saying that it happened or it didn't happen or it's materially impossible. And then there's that whole, I would say it's like a blossoming flower of symbolic significance that needs to be examined.
It's interesting because I think about this idea of truth or false dichotomies as really problematic. And I'll tell you an example of where they're problematic. I, for a while, was conducting research in long-term care homes with a colleague of mine and a good friend of mine, and a bigger research group. She and I were the only ones who had a humanities background. The rest of the folks came from sciences, social sciences, and primarily from medicine. And so when we were doing our research on long-term care homes, they were systemically rejecting things that weren't true. So they were like, this could not have happened, therefore this person is lying. Whereas my colleague and I, and I'm not going to name her just because I don't want to implicate or speak on behalf of her. But she and I looked at this and we were like, yes, but what if there's something beyond that? What if they are telling these stories that may be factually quote unquote untrue, but are not useless information? There's a reason why that person is telling that story. There is a truthiness or something about it that speaks to them as a truth. They believe it, they want to express it in whatever form of mental health they're in or whatever form of dementia they're experiencing. This story has stuck with them for a reason. And it is useful for us to still look at to be like, okay, this particular person claims to have met Queen Elizabeth. Why is that significant for them? Why do they fixate on this figure? And so I think about this idea when we think about the supernatural as well, that we don't need to be sitting there being like, your story is a lie. We need to look at, so what does your story tell us? What are the key factors that come out of your storytelling? And so it's part of that idea of clean listening, putting aside the assumptions that we have about what is right or what is wrong, and trying to actually listen to people and be like, your story matters. I am curious about what you have to say. And I have ideas about it as well. But I'm fascinated with what you have to say. And I think that's really key, especially when we're doing work around like paranormal phenomenon or cryptids or anything that is viewed as like other, that we come at it with this perspective of, hey, your knowledge is valuable, your experiences are valuable, and we want to learn and listen from you.
Absolutely. I think one of the worst things you can say to someone is to diminish what they say, right? And that's across the board. Uh, to not be judgmental and not be ultimately cruel when you're doing that, and that goes for any experience that's even outside of disability studies and the paranormal. It's like actually just listen to people. Is that hard?
Exactly. And especially I think about this in terms of things like ghost stories, right? There is a reason why someone is telling their ghost story. But interestingly enough, already within the ghost story is often a claim to authenticity. So this is something folklorists have noted, that often in telling the ghost story, the first thing that people say is, I don't personally believe it, but my friend does. And you know, they are a reverend or some claim to authority. And so they would know. And their roommate had this happen. And so there's an interesting phenomenon where folks distance themselves from the phenomenon, but also claim authority. So they say, like, I don't really believe in it, but you know who does? And so I'll tell you the story because they believe in it. This happens also. Barbara Raiety looks at Newfoundland fairy tales and talks about this idea within those as well, that when there's encounters with the fairy folk around Newfoundland who are recording these stories will say, well, this belief is leaving Newfoundland. And they've been saying that for a century at least, that the fairy beliefs are leaving Newfoundland. They're not, right? They're very entrenched, but still we get that idea of it wasn't me and I don't believe in it, but you know who does. And so I think that's fascinating.
Hmm. Absolutely. Oh, Derek, I am humbled by what you've been sharing with us today. I'm amazed, and I consider this to be an open invitation that I might poke you from time to
Yeah,
time to have more conversations. Well, in fact, if we do collaborate, which we will collaborate, we do have
yes.
to have future episodes on both your Speculating Canada site and on Paranormal Matters, where we can continue these conversations. So, is there anything else that you would like to add that perhaps I didn't get to, or we didn't cover, or
I think we're good. And I suggest we've got material for other episodes as well in the future, especially around like we talked about grifter phenomenon as well. And so I think we could talk for a full episode almost about the grifter phenomenon and the way that people have appropriated um, psychic phenomena and paranormal phenomena to actually exploit people.
absolutely. And this actually that's the other side of the coin to the spiritualist movement, where uh, if you're not getting results this time, then maybe you can fake it this time. So that tricksterism goes both ways, right?
Exactly.
So there's plenty more for you and I to talk about. And I'm not saying that to dismiss spiritualism because
So,
but
and
we have to be open and critical of every topic.
exactly. And I think that's key as well, because I think there's an immense value for spiritualism within our society, that it serves an important purpose, that it speaks to an alternative way of viewing religion, or spiritual practices that is not based in an existing space, although it is sort of, sorry, that's a complicated
Oh
phenomenon.
no, it
Uh,
is.
right? But I think there's something really valuable about it. And in terms of these alternative spiritualities, there is something really significant about them. They are challenging the status quo. They're providing a space for marginalized voices. But like with any religious movement, spiritual movement, there are people who exploit. And so it's,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And if we start saying that it's not open to discussion or critique, then are we actually talking about a cult, right? Because they're perfect in every way. So
right? There's a danger of fundamentalism within them as well. And so this is something we've talked about before, but there are folks who present the idea of spiritualism as almost fundamentalist. Like there is only one belief. That belief is espoused by such and such person. Anything that doesn't conform to that is evil. So we still see some of that happening within these movements, particularly when there is that fundamentalist focus, when people
absolutely.
want to have an absolute true doctrine.
Mhm.
Um, so it's really fascinating. Sorry, I'm geeking out again.
No, no, we have enough material for part two of innumerable episodes. So,
Yes.
well, thank you once again, Derek, for your time. And it was a real treat having you share your thoughts with us today.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great discussion, and I look forward to future collaborations.